A photograph from 1919 shows a man standing next to what appears to be a human skull the size of a watermelon. The digger, Ralph Glidden, claimed he'd just unearthed it from a burial mound on Catalina Island, 26 miles off the California coast. He would go on to excavate what he said were thousands of giant skeletons over the next 15 years. Museums displayed his findings. Newspapers ran breathless headlines. Then, almost overnight, the bones vanished. What really happened on that island? Catalina sits in the Pacific, part of California's Channel Islands chain. Today, it's known for tourist submarines and weekend getaways. But in the early 1900s, it was something else entirely. A place where amateur archaeologists could dig freely, where burial sites dotted the hillsides, and where one man's obsession would birth a legend that refuses to die. Ralph Glidden wasn't a trained archaeologist. He was a mining engineer who'd caught the excavation bug. In 1919, he arrived on Catalina with shovels, notebooks, and an unshakable belief that something extraordinary lay beneath the island's soil. The indigenous Tongva people had lived there for thousands of years, and their burial practices left distinctive mounds scattered across the landscape. Glidden wanted to know what those mounds contained. What he claimed to find defied explanation. Skeletons, he reported, measuring 7 to 9 feet tall, skulls significantly larger than modern human proportions, femurs that suggested individuals towering over any known population. He photographed his discoveries, cataloged them meticulously, and started shipping bones to museums. Within a few years, his Catalina Museum displayed over 4,000 skeletons, many of which he insisted belonged to a race of giants. The newspapers ate it up. Headlines screamed about lost race of giants and ancient titans of California. Scientific American mentioned his work. The Smithsonian reportedly showed interest. Glidden himself gave lectures, showing slides of enormous skulls and comparing measurements to demonstrate the statistical impossibility of such proportions occurring naturally in standard populations. But here's where things get strange. Not the skeletons themselves. We'll get to those. But what happened next? Museums that had displayed the bones quietly removed them. Photographs that once circulated widely became harder to find. Records of Glidden's excavations, once detailed in local papers, grew vague and contradictory. By the 1950s, most physical evidence had simply disappeared. Some would say this proves a cover-up. Ancient astronaut theorists point to it as evidence of suppressed history. But the real story is more complicated, more fascinating, and ultimately more human than any conspiracy. Let's start with what we know for certain. The Tongva people did live on Catalina for at least 8,000 years. Archaeological evidence confirms extensive burial sites across the island. These weren't simple graves. They were complex burial mounds, carefully constructed, indicating sophisticated cultural practices. When European settlers arrived, they found these sites and, like Glidden, began digging. The practice was appallingly common. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, amateur archaeologists routinely excavated Native American burial sites with little regard for cultural sensitivity or scientific rigor. They were treasure hunters, essentially, looking for artifacts to sell or display. Glidden was part of this wave, though he at least attempted systematic documentation. His photographs still exist in archives. And here's what they actually show. Yes, some skulls appear unusually large. Yes, some bones seem elongated. But context matters desperately. First, photographic tricks. Early cameras used glass plates and required long exposure times. Positioning objects closer to the lens while keeping the human subject farther back could create dramatic size distortions. Glidden wasn't necessarily being deceptive. This was common practice in archaeological photography of the era to show detail. But it created misleading impressions. Second, the skulls themselves. The Tongva, like many coastal populations, practiced cranial modification. Parents would bind infants' heads with boards and wrappings, gradually reshaping the skull as it grew. This wasn't harmful. The brain adapted perfectly, but it created distinctly elongated skull shapes. To someone unfamiliar with the practice, these skulls could easily appear giant, especially when photographed at misleading angles. Third, and this is crucial, Glidden measured differently than modern anthropologists. He included burial goods in his measurements. If a skeleton was buried with shells, beads, or other objects extending above the head or below the feet, he measured the entire burial space, not just the bones. His 9-foot giant might have been a 6-foot individual with 3 feet of ceremonial objects. But that's not the end of it, because something genuinely unusual was happening on Catalina. Something that has nothing to do with giants or ancient aliens, but everything to do with isolation, genetics, and evolutionary biology. The Channel Islands were never connected to the mainland, even during ice ages when sea levels dropped dramatically. Any population living there had to cross water, which meant limited gene flow. Small, isolated populations developed distinctive characteristics through a process called genetic drift. Without constant mixing with larger populations, certain traits become amplified or suppressed simply through statistical chance. Modern genetic studies of Channel Island populations show exactly this. The indigenous people developed unique genetic markers not found in mainland populations. Some of these relate to bone structure, not gigantism, but variations in skeletal robustness, joint size, and cranial capacity that fall outside typical ranges. Here's where it gets interesting. When anthropologists finally examined the few remaining Catalina skeletons using modern techniques, they found something unexpected. The individuals were indeed taller than average for Native American populations of that era. Not 7 feet tall, but a solid 5'10" to 6'2". That might not sound impressive now, but in the early 1900s, when the average American male stood 5'7", a population averaging 6 feet would have seemed genuinely giant. More striking, their bone density was unusual. Island populations often develop heavier, more robust skeletons due to dietary factors and genetic drift. The Catalina skeletons showed this pattern. Their bones were thicker, their joints more pronounced, their skulls slightly larger to accommodate the same brain volume, but with more robust features. Add cranial modification to naturally robust skeletons. Photograph them at misleading angles. Measure burial spaces rather than bones. And suddenly, you have giants. Glidden wasn't necessarily lying. He was seeing something real, a population that did look different, that did have unusual skeletal characteristics, but interpreting it through the lens of early 20th century understanding, which was primitive compared to modern genetics and anthropology. The question becomes, why did the evidence disappear? Part of it was cultural. By mid-century, attitudes toward Native American remains had begun shifting. The practice of displaying indigenous skeletons in museums became increasingly controversial. Institutions started quietly removing such exhibits, returning remains to tribal authorities, or simply storing them away. Glidden's collection became an embarrassment, not because it proved giants, but because it represented cultural insensitivity. Part of it was scientific. As anthropological methods improved, researchers examining the bones found them interesting but not extraordinary. They didn't fit the giant narrative. So interest waned. Without sensational implications, the collection lost its appeal to both popular audiences and serious researchers. And part of it was simple neglect. Glidden died in 1967. His museum closed. The collection was dispersed, sold, lost, or destroyed. This wasn't conspiracy. It was the mundane tragedy of poor record-keeping and changing priorities. But here's what haunts researchers today. We don't have good records of what was actually found. Glidden's documentation, while better than many contemporaries, was still amateur. He didn't use standardized measurements. He didn't preserve tissue samples for future analysis. He didn't photograph bones in consistent orientations with scale references. Modern archaeologists looking at his photographs can identify probable cranial modification, likely photographic distortion, and possible measurement errors. But they can't rule out the possibility that some individuals in that population genuinely fell into unusual size ranges. island populations can develop surprising variations. Without the bones themselves, we're left with educated guesses. The Smithsonian's involvement adds another layer. Documents confirm they received materials from Glidden's excavations, but their records are frustratingly vague. Some specimens were cataloged as unusual cranial specimens from Channel Islands. Others were noted as representative samples, California indigenous populations. None were specifically flagged as giants. This could mean the Smithsonian examined them, found nothing extraordinary, and filed them as routine acquisitions. Or it could mean they recognized something unusual but lacked the framework to interpret it. So they used neutral language. Without examining those specific specimens, and most have been repatriated or are unavailable for study under NAGPRA regulations, we simply don't know. What we do know is that the Catalina population was genuinely distinct. Modern genetic analysis of the few tissue samples that exist show markers indicating thousands of years of isolation. They were more closely related to ancient Paleo-Indian populations than to later arrivals. They had adapted to island life in ways that affected their skeletal structure, their diet, and their overall physiology. They weren't giants, but they weren't identical to mainland populations either. They were something in between, a genuine genetic offshoot, shaped by isolation into something recognizably different, yet fundamentally human. And that's actually more fascinating than giants, because it shows evolution happening in real time, on a human scale, in a way we can trace and document. The Catalina population represents a natural experiment in human adaptation, a glimpse at what happens when a group is cut off from the larger gene pool for millennia. The tragedy is that we'll never fully understand what made them unique, because the bones are gone. The photographs remain, tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. Glidden's notes survive in fragments, enough to raise questions but not to answer them. And the island itself has been developed, its burial sites mostly disturbed or destroyed, making new archaeological work nearly impossible. What we're left with is a story that refuses to resolve cleanly. Was Glidden a charlatan who faked evidence to sell tickets to his museum? The photographic record suggests not. He genuinely found unusual remains. Was he a serious researcher whose findings were suppressed? The scientific record suggests not. Experts who examined the bones found them interesting but explainable. Was he something in between? An enthusiastic amateur who saw something real but misinterpreted it through the lens of his era's limited understanding? That last option seems closest to the truth, and it raises a more intriguing question. What else might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for modern techniques to reveal its true nature? How many other mysteries are actually genuine biological phenomena that we lack the framework to properly interpret? The giants of Catalina Island weren't giants, but they were something worth studying, a distinct population with unique adaptations that we'll never fully understand, because we lost the evidence before we developed the tools to analyze it properly. That's the real tragedy here. Not a conspiracy, but simple human short-sightedness. And yet, the legend persists, because people want to believe in giants. They want to believe that something extraordinary existed just beyond the edge of our everyday experience. The truth, that the Catalina population was fascinatingly unusual but still human, doesn't quite scratch that itch. But maybe it should, because the real story, the one about isolated populations developing distinctive traits, about evolutionary forces shaping human diversity in unexpected ways, about how much we still don't understand about our own species, that story is plenty extraordinary on its own.